There is a particular kind of wound that doesn't bleed when it's made. It seals over immediately, becomes part of the landscape of you so early that you stop recognizing it as a wound at all and start experiencing it simply as the shape of your life. You build around it. You build so well, in fact, that you can go years, decades, genuinely believing you're fine, genuinely believing the sealed over place is solid ground. And then something happens that puts pressure on it, and you find out that sealed is not the same as healed, not even close. My name is Joel. I'm 34 years old. I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I was adopted at the age of 3 by a couple named Robert and Sandra Hotch, who are among the finest people I have ever known, and who gave me a childhood so stable and loving that I genuinely had very little reason to spend time thinking about the woman who gave me up. So I didn't, mostly. My biological mother's name was Carla. I knew almost nothing about her for most of my life. My adoptive parents were honest with me from an age-appropriate point forward. I had been placed in foster care when I was 2.5 because my birth mother was unable to care for me. They didn't have many details beyond that, and the details they had they shared carefully, without editorializing, because they were the kind of people who understood that the story wasn't theirs to shape. They told me her first name. They told me she was young, 20 when I was born. They told me the decision to place me had been, as far as they understood, one made out of a recognition that she couldn't provide what I needed. They did not tell me she was a good person or a bad person because they didn't know, and they said so. I grew up in a good house. Dad was a high school history teacher who coached track on the side. Mom, Sandra, my mom in every way that the word means anything, was a pediatric nurse who had a warmth so reliable you could set your internal clock by it. They had tried for years to have biological children, and it hadn't happened. And then they had tried adoption and gotten me, and neither of them ever made me feel like a consolation prize or a substitute. They were theirs. It was that simple. I did not search for Carla as a teenager, which some adoptees do. I thought about it occasionally, the way you think about something when it lives at the edge of your attention without ever quite moving to the center. I wondered about her in the way you wonder about the weather in a city you've never visited, abstractly, without urgency. I had a family. I had parents who came to everything, who helped me move into my college dorm and cried slightly in the parking lot, who called regularly and showed up consistently and loved me with the same quiet reliability my father had brought to every baseball game of Raymond Calloway's life, though I didn't know that story then, obviously. I married at 28. My wife's name is Diane, and I need to tell you clearly that Diane is not the villain of this story, even though she is going to do something that hurt me profoundly. She is a person who was put in an impossible situation and responded in a way that was human and understandable and still devastating. I want to be fair to her because the story deserves fairness, and so does she. Diane and I met at a work conference. We're both in supply chain logistics, which sounds boring and mostly is, but it pays well and we're good at it. And we dated for 2 years before I proposed. We were married in the fall in a ceremony that my mom Sandra cried through in the particular way she cried through everything important, which was silently and with great dignity, and with tears streaming completely unchecked down her face. It remains one of my favorite images of my life. Diane and I bought a house. We talked about kids. Someday, not yet. We had a dog named Parliament who was a large, opinionated beagle with boundary issues that we both adored. Life was ordinary in the best sense of the word. Life was the kind of ordinary you don't fully appreciate until the ground shifts. The ground shifted on a Thursday in October when I was 32 years old. I came home from work to find a woman sitting on my front porch steps. She was slight, maybe 5'4", with gray threaded heavily through dark hair and the specific kind of thinness that doesn't read as healthy. She was probably 52 years old, but she looked older,
the way people look older when their bodies have been through something prolonged and significant. She was sitting with her hands folded in her lap, and she looked up when I got out of my car, and I knew. I don't know how, I had no photograph, no reference point, but I knew before she said a single word. She said, "Joel, I'm Carla. I'm your birth mother. I'm sorry to just show up like this." I stood on the walkway to my own house and looked at this woman for what felt like a long time, but was probably about 6 seconds. And then I said, "How did you find my address?" It was not the first question I would have predicted myself asking, but it was the one that came out. She had found me through a DNA ancestry service. Apparently, I had done one of those consumer DNA tests a few years back out of curiosity and uploaded my results to a database that she had also registered with. She had found the match, confirmed through public records who I was and where I lived, and then had spent what she described as several months deciding whether to make contact and how. She showed up in person rather than sending a letter because she was afraid a letter would be easier to throw away. I understood that logic while finding it slightly alarming as a method of introduction. I did not invite her in that first evening. I told her I needed time, and I asked her to give me a number where I could reach her. She wrote it on a receipt from her purse, the back of a gas station receipt, which for some reason is a detail I've never forgotten, and she handed it to me and said, "I understand if you decide not to call. I understand completely, but I would like to explain some things if you'll let me, and there are also things you need to know about my health." She left. I stood on the porch with a gas station receipt in my hand, and then I went inside and sat at the kitchen table and didn't move until Diane got home 40 minutes later. Diane's response in that initial conversation was everything I could have asked for. She listened, she held my hand, she said it was entirely my decision and that she would support whatever I chose. She meant all the right things, and she meant them at the time. I want to be clear that she meant them at the time. What neither of us knew yet was that meaning something in the abstract is categorically different from living it in the concrete. I called Carla the next day. Over the following 2 weeks, we had a series of phone calls that were unlike any conversations I had ever had because they had no template. There is no established script for talking to the woman who gave birth to you and gave you up and is now calling you from what I gradually understood was a motel about 20 minutes from my house, where she had been staying since she arrived in Knoxville. She was not here. She was originally from eastern Kentucky, had spent most of her adult life in various parts of Tennessee and Virginia. She had driven to Knoxville specifically to find me. The health situation she had referenced on the porch was this. She had been diagnosed 8 months earlier with a particularly aggressive form of liver cancer. It had been caught late. She had gone through one round of treatment that had been, in her words, more destructive than the disease and less effective than they had hoped. She was told by her oncologist that she likely had somewhere between 4 and 8 months remaining, possibly less. She was, at the point she appeared on my porch, functionally alone in the world. She had never married, she had no other children, her own mother had died years ago, her father had been out of her life since her childhood, she had a brother in Kentucky she was not in contact with. Whatever community she had built over the decades was thin and scattered, the kind of network that holds for ordinary difficulty but not for the specific, prolonged weight of dying. She was not asking me to forgive her. She was careful about this, careful in a way that I appreciated and also found painful, because the carefulness told me she had thought about it, had anticipated the conversation, had deliberately decided not to ask for something she didn't feel she had the right to request. She told me her reasons for placing me in adoption, which were complicated and involved her own history of instability, a relationship with my biological father that had been brief and harmful, and a 20-year-old's genuine terror that she would damage me if she kept me. She told me she had thought about me often over the years. She did not ask me to validate that or receive it in any particular way. She eventually asked, quietly on the 4th or 5th phone call after she had given me as much context as she could, whether there was any possibility I would be willing to let her stay somewhere close to me in her remaining time. Not in my house necessarily, nearby, close enough that if things deteriorated, she would not be entirely alone. I talked to Diane, and Diane, to her credit, did not say no immediately. She sat with it. She talked to me about it across multiple evenings. She was honest that it made her profoundly uncomfortable, that inviting a stranger into our life who happened to share my DNA was different from what she had signed up for, that she worried what it would cost me emotionally, that it would cost us. These were legitimate concerns, and I heard them.
But I kept coming back to one thing that I couldn't resolve. Carla was going to die, probably within months, and she was going to do it alone in a motel room or wherever her money ran out first. And whatever she had or hadn't done, whatever wound her leaving had sealed over in me at 2 years old, she was the person my body had come from. She was, in some fundamental biological sense, the origin of me, and I could not figure out how to live with having turned her away. I told Diane I wanted to let Carla stay in our guest room. Diane said yes. She said it clearly and without ultimatum, and I believed her. And for a while, the first month, maybe 6 weeks, it was hard but functional. Carla was unobtrusive to the point of self-erasure, as if she was afraid that taking up too much space would remind us we could ask her to leave. She helped around the house in small ways. She and Diane had careful, polite conversations. Parliament, the beagle, adored her immediately, which I took as a good sign because Parliament was an excellent judge of character and a terrible judge of personal boundaries. But illness doesn't stay quiet. Over the following weeks, as the cancer progressed, Carla needed more. More care, more attention, more of the practical and emotional labor that dying requires. I stepped into that without fully calculating what it would cost me because there was no good moment to do that math. There was always something immediate that needed handling. Medications and appointments and the specific domestic choreography of managing someone who is becoming increasingly physically diminished. I called in favors at work to adjust my schedule. I learned things about hospice care that I never anticipated knowing. I sat with Carla in the evenings when she was awake and alert, and those conversations were the strangest gift. Learning a person's entire history in reverse, starting with the end and working backward through a life I hadn't been present for. She was funny in a dry, self-deprecating way I recognized from somewhere internal. She had opinions about things and wasn't afraid to express them. She had made significant mistakes, and she knew it with a clarity that wasn't self-pitying, but wasn't self-forgiving either. I realized, somewhere in the middle of all of it, in the process of grieving someone I had never known. I was grieving the version of my childhood that could have been, the mother she might have been if things had been different, the relationship we were now trying to compress into months that should have had decades. It was a specific and exhausting kind of grief to carry while the person you were grieving was still alive and in your guest room. Diane began to withdraw. Not dramatically, not with announced intent. She withdrew the way water lowers in a drought, gradually and then noticeably. She came home later, she found reasons to be elsewhere on weekends. The conversations we had about it were circular and painful. She said she felt like she had lost her home, that our life had been reconfigured around someone else's crisis without her fully consenting to the extent of it, that she was watching me pour everything I had into a woman who had not been there for me in any of the ways that counted. She wasn't wrong exactly, she was describing something real, but she was also asking me to measure what I owed against what had been given, and I couldn't do that arithmetic with a dying woman down the hall. I called Sandra, my mom, my real mom, the woman who had raised me, to tell her what was happening. I had told her about Carla's arrival, but I had been vague about the extent of the situation, partly to protect her feelings and partly because I wasn't ready to process her reaction on top of everything else. Her reaction was not what I expected. She wasn't angry exactly. She was hurt in a way she tried very hard not to show and couldn't quite manage. She said she was worried about me. She said she thought I was taking on something that wasn't my responsibility. And then she said, carefully, that she hoped I knew that whatever I felt I needed to do for Carla didn't reflect on what she and my dad had given me, that she wasn't in competition with a dying woman. The fact that she felt she needed to say that, the fact that the competition felt real enough to acknowledge and deny simultaneously, broke my heart in a way that added to the accumulating pile of heartbreak that those months had become. Carla died in my guest room on a Tuesday morning in March, 4.5 months after she had appeared on my porch steps. I was with her. Diane was not. She had started staying with her sister several nights a week by then, and not particular Tuesday was one of those nights. I sat with Carla until the hospice nurse arrived, and then I went downstairs and made coffee and sat at my kitchen table and felt the specific, disorienting silence of a house that has been organized around someone's dying and now has to figure out what it is without that structure. Diane and I lasted 4 more months after that. The marriage had sustained damage that neither of us had the resources left to repair. We had both given so much to the preceding months, in different directions and with different costs, that what remained between us wasn't enough to rebuild from. The divorce was not hostile. We were two people who loved each other and been overwhelmed by something neither of us had fully understood when we agreed to it. We see each other occasionally. It is cordial and sad in the particular way of things that ended not from failure of feeling, but from failure of capacity. My mother Sandra took time to come back to where we were. It required several honest conversations, conversations I hadn't been capable of having while everything was happening, but could manage once the immediate crisis had passed. I told her that nothing I had done for Carla had diminished what she and my dad had built in me. I told her she was my mother in every way that word contained meaning. I told her that what I had given Carla was something separate, not a replacement for what I had with her, but a response to a specific and unrepeatable situation that I had not known how to turn away from. She heard me. She needed time, but she heard me. We are good now. We are ourselves again, or close enough. Parliament the Beagle still sleeps on the bed, though the bed is now just mine in an apartment I moved to after the house sold. He's 8 years old and showing his age the way beagles do, with increasing stubbornness and selective deafness that I find both maddening and deeply endearing. What I know now that I'm on the other side of all of it is that the sealed-over wound I had been building on for 30 years finally got examined, opened, cleaned out, treated. Not without significant cost, not without collateral damage that I carried genuine guilt about, because Diane deserved more than she got, and my mother Sandra was asked to absorb something painful. Not without the specific ache of spending months getting to know a person and then losing her before the knowing felt complete. But I don't regret saying yes to Carla. I've examined that decision from every angle I have available, and I keep arriving at the same conclusion. I could not have lived well with a no. The person I am, the person Robert and Sandra Hotch built, who turns out has some of Carla's dry humor and her way of sitting with uncomfortable things without needing to resolve them immediately, that person could not have turned a dying woman from his door and remained intact. I was not a good husband in those months. I was not a sufficiently thoughtful son. I was not many things I should have been. But I was present for something that needed presence, and I held a person through the end of their life, and I have decided that counts for something. On the last night she was coherent, Carla told me she was sorry. Not for dying, for leaving. For the 2-year-old she had walked away from, for the mother she hadn't been, for the 32 years in which she knew I existed and had not found the courage to make contact until the timeline forced it. She said, "I'm sorry." I told her I knew. I told her I understood, which was not entirely true, but was true enough and was what the moment required. She said, "You turned out well. I can't take credit for it, but you turned out well." I said, "I had good parents." She said, "I know. I'm glad." And I believe she was. That's the thing I hold on to when the complicated feelings get heavy, that she was glad.
that whatever she had and hadn't done, she died knowing I had been okay. She died without that particular weight, and I was able to give her that, and it cost me a great deal, and I would do it again. I would do it again.